Well, there are three people or characters or groups of characters that are of concern in this morning's scripture. There's Samuel, there's Samuel's sons, and there's God. And I'm going to focus a little bit on each of the three, but more on the latter. Have you noticed that no matter how much of a mess that we make of our lives, God never gives up on us? We try to do the right thing, but if you're like I am, often we fail over and over and over again. And Paul, in his gospel, talks frequently about that. He talks about the fact that he knows the right thing to do, but he doesn't always do it. He doesn't always seem to have the capacity to do it. Can't help himself. One of my favorite early day TV comics used to say, "The devil made me do it." I guess it all started with the first Adam, and it has continued ever since, down through the centuries, even to include us. What a mess we keep making of things. Theologians call it sin, and they say it touches all. I just call it the human condition. Don't get all involved in whether it's sin or not. It is our human condition to make mistakes. And it's not just you that stumbles and makes missteps all along through your life. It's all of us. We all keep making mistakes and making missteps throughout our life. Some of those may be on purpose and some of them may be accidental. But we know the difference. Insurance adjusters often have to deal with people who had automobile accidents, and they call in from their wrecked cars. And the insurance adjuster will assure the person it's going to be all right. That's why we call them accidents. And the problem is that we can't take back those accidents in life any more than we can put toothpaste back into a tube after it's squirted out. What a mess we can make of our lives. And some of those things that we make a mess of, we try to cover up. Some of them we just try to justify and live with. But unfortunately, some of them can gnaw at us for years because we can't let them go. The good news is that God is always there, patiently waiting for us to allow Him to pick up the pieces of our mistakes. Why? Why does God never give up on us? We'll see as we go through the sermon, I hope. But that's exactly what I want you to see from the story of Samuel and his sons. Those people were consistently complaining about the need for a king. And if you look carefully at this story, you'll see that there are three elements of that story. The first one is this: Samuel's sons have made a mess of things, and the people don't see any good prospects for their future. If Samuel's sons are the next ones to take over after Samuel, the people see very clearly that the future is dim. What's wrong with Samuel's sons? Well, they were only out for themselves. They were trying to feather their own nests for their own good, for their own well-being, when they were supposed to be providing service and leading God's people. They made their kind of abuses look calm, or rather heavy compared to the abuses that we saw a few years ago with Enron and Tyco. Those looked like a school picnic compared to what Samuel's sons were doing to their people. And it's kind of further proof, I think, that unethical behavior is not something that has just come about in the last 5, 10, 15, 20, or 30 years. Unethical behavior has been around since time immemorial. It hasn't just begun. But apparently, Samuel's sons never figured that out. And the people under their care had figured it out, and they were going to have no part of it. They wanted a king. They wanted a change, and they wanted it now. Kind of like you and I think sometimes. We want what we want, and what we want is what we want it now. And these people were not at all timid about expressing their feelings and what it is they wanted. There's a story that I like that I think highlights this concept. It's about a young monk who entered a monastery. And when he came in, the abbot told him, "You will only be able to utter 2 words every 5 years." Well, the guy was committed to being a monk, but he didn't like the idea of not being able to talk. But he grudgingly agreed with the abbot. At the end of the first 5 years, the abbot came to the monk and he said, "Well now, what are your 2 words?" And he says, "Bed hard." The end of the next 5 years, the abbot came to the monk and he said, "What are your 2 words?" And he says, "Food bad." At the end of the final 5 years, he says, "Now what are your 2 words you have?" And he says, "Want out." And the abbot says, "Well, I'm really not surprised. You've done nothing but complain since the day you got here." You see, some people complain a lot. Some people complain just for the sake of complaining. But in Samuel's case, it looks really like the people had plenty to complain about. They were worried about their future. They were worried about their children. And the old man Samuel had been a good leader, but his kids left a lot to be desired. The people were determined to make these changes, and so they asked for this king. After all, other nations had a king, and if they moved from the status of having just a judge to a king, that was going to kind of elevate them with their neighbors. Notice what God does in this very crucial period of time in biblical history. You see, he could have intervened to stop it all. He could have intervened and stopped Samuel's kids from fleecing the people and leading them in the wrong direction. He could have rescued his faithful servant Samuel and made Samuel look good in the eyes of his people, and could have saved his judgeship, could have saved Samuel from a lot of stress, and he could have helped Samuel let the people know that getting a king is not necessarily a solution to their problems. But what does God do instead? God simply lets things take their own course. And he lets Samuel and their people sort it out. That's typical of the God we read about in the Old Testament. And some people think it becomes a mean and angry God. But it's a God who lets you choose. We call it free will. And why did God give us that free will and let us choose? We can choose right or we can choose wrong, but we have to pay the consequences while God stands aside and watches us. Well, God decided from the very beginning of time, from the real get-go of this whole deal, he decided he was not going to treat us like a bunch of little puppets on a string, like a little marionette, with him pulling the string to decide what we do and what we don't do. He gave us free will. He gave us the right to choose, and also the right to make our mistakes, and the right to suffer the consequences for those mistakes. So in our story this morning, God stands in the shadows to see what we are going to do. Are we going to continue to gripe and complain about our situation and whatever life we're in, and complain even and ask for a change, even though we have no idea what that change will bring about for us? What is poor Samuel supposed to do with all these people out there protesting in front of him? Instead of intervening to save the day, or even instead of just deciding we're just not worth it and washes his hands from the whole thing, God never gives up. And that leads to the second message of the three that I talked about. It's Samuel. Kids make a mess of things. Now Samuel makes a mess of things. He makes a mess of things because he takes everything too personally about his leadership, and how easy that is to do for you and I, to take things too personal. And in this story we have jumped very quickly from Samuel's birth and his boyhood to his semi-retirement. He's thinking about hanging it up and retiring and finding out what that's all about. Samuel is really hoping beyond all hopes that his sons can pick up the ball and run with it and rule the kingdom, that they will be up to the task. But in the back of his mind, he probably knows, I've seen these kids growing up, I've watched them making these mistakes, and I see what they're doing, but he still keeps hoping beyond all hope that they will get it right. You know, sometimes I think, as parents, we think God gave us our kids and put them through the teenage years so that when they move away and go to college, we're not going to be too sad that they're gone. That we see the messes that they can make. But in this case, in Samuel's sons' cases, they were in a position, in fact, did change biblical history. And it was not for the good. So what did Samuel do? He turned to his old friend for help. Think of that. He turns to his old friend for help. Who was his old friend? You heard the story. God. God was his old friend. And he was the one who was waiting in the wings, waiting to see what Samuel was going to do. Was he going to do like most of us try to do? Fix things on our own? But Samuel was a highly religious man. He knew better than try to solve this one by himself. Instead, he probably took a deep breath. He headed off for some time with God. And Samuel had learned a long time ago that worrying about something didn't get him anywhere. In fact, it seemed like if he let worry eat at him, would mean that he didn't really trust God. He needed to trust God to handle the situation for him. Samuel may not have been the smartest guy in the world, but one thing Samuel had was he had an abundance of faith in God. And it is that faith in God, that leads him back to God in prayer. And he prays about these affronts that he is facing from the crowd as a leader and the attacks on his family. And so what does God do? God pats him on the hand, and he says, "Relax, Samuel. I've been here before. This is really not my first rodeo. I've dealt with situations like this before. It's me, God, the people are attacking. It's not you. You need to learn how to self-differentiate. It's so easy to take something personal when you're in a position like Samuel was, because Samuel was the only representative the people had where they could see God. He was the only representative in sight, and so they took out their being mad at God on Samuel. And you know, there are times church leaders feel that and understand that as well, that it's easy to take it out on the messenger. And I think God was trying to let Samuel see that. He says, "Relax, it's me. Get out of yourself and quit worrying about yourself." And God reminds Samuel that there are some things in life that you just have to learn to let go and let God, to give it over to God's loving hands. And after all, that's what prayer really is, my friends. Prayer is a place to let our worries and our anxieties go. What we need to say is this: God, I've tried everything I can to solve this problem all by myself. I'm letting this worry go to you. God, it's all yours now. And that's what Samuel finally figured out in this lesson. But God still doesn't intervene. He allows the people to have their way. He says, "Okay, you want a king? Go ahead and have a king. I know it's probably not in your best interest, but that's okay. You go ahead and have your king." And that's the third point of the service. God never gave up on the people to allow them to make their own decisions, whether they were good decisions or bad decisions, to know that everything isn't going to be perfect under the king as they think it will. But God is like that loving parent that many of us understand. He gives his children room to make their mistakes. God gives them what they're asking for, knowing that it probably isn't going to work out in their best interest. And the whole point of that is God's undying generosity and his undying grace. And you know, we see that things haven't really changed throughout human history. We always think we can do it ourselves. No need to turn it over to God, at least until it gets so bad that it just can't be solved any other way. And the good news is this: God is always there, waiting for us to say, "Will you pick up the pieces, God?" Whether it's early in our trouble or late in our trouble, no matter what we do. In a recent meditation, I read about a person who was having difficulties following God's will. And that person wrote, "I was outside praying for willingness when I raised my eye and I saw a huge bird rising in the sky. I watched it suddenly give itself up to the powerful air currents of the mountains. It was swept along, swooping and soaring, and the bird did things that were seemingly impossible for mortal birds to do. It was an inspiring example of a fellow creature letting go to a power greater than itself. I realized that if the bird took back its will and tried to fly with less trust, to do it on its power alone, it would spoil its apparent free flight. From Samuel on, humanity keeps making a mess of the things we do, even today. So God knows that, and he does something radical. God gives us a new king, a king of kings, a Lord of lords, the one who picks up when we can only see that things are on the downside. Because of him, because of that king, we have God's assurance that he will always be there with us, cleaning up the messes that we make of our lives. And that's why we should never, ever give up on God. Because God never, ever gives up on us. Amen.
Amen.